affecting the state of nature. Hi, welcome back. In the previous segment, we saw Thomas Hobbes' argument that in the absence of some external force, such as a state, to hold our natures in check, there will be a natural state of war where every man is an enemy to every man. And in that situation, Hobbes argues, life would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. In Hobbes' argument, one premise was that we are roughly equal in terms of our strength and wit and other abilities. So one thing we might ask, why does this matter that we're roughly equal? Why is this part of Hobbes' argument? So part of the answer for Hobbes is that we won't even get to a place of the strong dominating the weak in the state of nature. We might think that would be bad, but at least it would be stable, although it might be oppressive for those on the weak side or those on the sort of less talented side. But if we're roughly equal, and Hobbes imagines that we are, at least in this sense, we can continue to fight and respond to each other's attacks on us in a way that never ends, that never reaches an equilibrium. So not only is there the violence, but there's the kind of constant instability. So a second thing we might ask, having thought a little bit about the equality part, is whether Hobbes' argument rests on an overly pessimistic view of human nature. So recall what I referred to as the third premise, that if there are conditions of natural equality, and if human beings possess these desires that Hobbes thinks we do, and there's no external checking force, then there will be a state of war where every man is enemy to every man. So one thing we might think is that perhaps we have the desires Hobbes attributes to us, but that premise 3 still might not be true. It might be that we do not act violently based on those desires, or at least many of us would not, even if we have those desires. So a related question is whether the only possible checking force is an external force, something like the state. Perhaps we can have a moral code that we live by, for example, so that our personal ethical beliefs would keep us in check, so that even if we have these desires for revenge, we wouldn't act on them. So in that case, we might deny premise 3, and we might think a state of nature doesn't necessarily lead to a war of all against all. So Hobbes thinks about this and says a few things about it. First, he suggests that in the state of nature, moral rules don't apply, or alternatively, that there are no moral rules. Somehow morality isn't present, and there are no rules of justice. So we'll talk some about that idea. And then second, he suggests that moral rules by themselves would be insufficient to keep us in check. So let's talk a little bit about both of those ideas. Regarding the first point, Hobbes says several different things, all of which we might put under the heading of, if there's no law, if there's no state, then all is permitted. So here's one kind of argument that Hobbes makes, and I'll refer to these premises as C1 and C2 just to keep them distinct. So C1. In the absence of some external checking force, such as a common power, there will be a natural state of war. C2. If there's a natural state of war, then one cannot obtain peace. C3. If one cannot obtain peace, then one is morally permitted to, and this is a quotation from Hobbes, seek and use all helps and advantages of war. Then the conclusion. In the absence of some external checking force, one is permitted to seek and use all helps and advantages of war. So one idea in the background for Hobbes is that we have a natural or quasi-moral right to self-preservation. We might also think of this as something like a you don't have to be a chump argument. So we could formulate that this way. Premise D1, each person has a right to self-defense by all means possible. D2, if everyone else agrees to lay down this right, then you should do so as well. D3, if some do not agree to lay down this right, then you do not have to. D4, the only way in which everyone will agree to lay down their right to self-defense is if there is a common power. D5, if there is no common power, then some will not agree to lay down their right to self-defense. Conclusion, if there's no common power, then you do not have to give up your right to self-defense. So Hobbes says various things which suggest he has this kind of idea in mind when he says that moral rules don't really apply to you in the state of nature. Perhaps related to these two conclusions, Hobbes thinks that a mere moral code without any external force to support it or to back it would be inadequate. So in chapter 17 he says, For the laws of nature, as justice, equity, modesty, mercy, and in some, doing to others as we would be done to, of themselves, without the terror of some power to cause them to be observed, are contrary to our natural passions, that carry us to partiality, pride, revenge, and the like. And covenants, without the sword, are but words, and of no strength to secure a man at all. So Hobbes suggests that the state of nature would be terrible, a war of all against all. And Hobbes suggests that we do need an external checking force, some sort of state or common power, to protect us against this war of all against all. So all of this motivates the argument for what Hobbes calls the sovereign. So here's what we might call the argument for the sovereign. Premise E1. For everyone, it is rational for them to want there to be a common power, and this is a quotation from Hobbes, able to defend them from the invasion of foreigners and the injuries of one another, and thereby to secure them in such sort as that by their own industry and by the fruits of the earth they may nourish themselves and live contentedly. Premise E2. The only way to establish a common power, one man or one assembly of men, as Hobbes puts it, is for each person to submit his or her will to the judgment of a sovereign. Conclusion. For everyone, it is rational for them to submit his or her will to the judgment of a sovereign. So, much has been said about what it is to submit one's will to the judgment of a sovereign, and whether that's a good idea, whether or not that would undermine our autonomy. We'll consider arguments of that sort later in segments dealing with autonomy. And you might note that E1, the first premise, is plausible if it is because of these foregoing arguments that we've had about the state of nature and the war of all against all. One could run the previous argument in a more or less moralized fashion. So you could say it's rational in these premises, or you could say it's morally obligatory. And there's debate about how to think about this argument for Hobbes. What about premise E2? So one thing Hobbes thinks is that the sovereign's power should be absolute. So this is a striking departure from how many of us think about the state, where we think of, well, the state has some power, but it can't just do whatever it wants. There are limitations to this. So we'll talk some about these limitations when we talk about the role of constitutions and sort of limiting the power of the state. But for Hobbes, the sovereign was supposed to have absolute power. This is a striking thing that many people have talked about and complained about in various ways about Hobbes's view. But for Hobbes, the reason for this absolute power was that if there's second guessing about what the common power does or can do, this will lead to instability and eventually lead us back into the state of war of all against all. So his worry was that if the sovereign had to sort of be limited in various ways, there'd be questions about the details of those limits, and we'd fight about those, eventually leading us all the way back into the state of nature, the war of all against all. But we needn't think that will be the case, and many people have tried to come up with ways of limiting the role of government, but doing it in a principled way that doesn't lead to chaos. So many after Hobbes have embraced a similar line of thought, thinking about how it would be rational for each of us to consent to the political system, to the state, or that it would be rational for us to enter into a social contract with each other so as to prevent a war of all against all, or, relatedly, to agree to work together and to lay down our weapons and not fight with each other. These are all ideas that have been taken up, many of which not accompanied by this absolute sovereign. So Hobbes is offering one rationale for the state that's been very popular, that it will help us to escape the state of nature, and in particular help us to live peaceably and productively with each other. So many of the views we'll consider in later segments can be seen as expansions or elaborations of this basic idea, with some of the differences stemming from different views about what it is to be bad about being in a state of nature. So some people think it's the violence, some think it's because we can't work together under those conditions. One question we should think about is how this kind of escaping the state of nature argument affects our views about the scope and power of the state. What kinds of things should the state be able to do if our reason for having the state is to escape the state of nature, to prevent this kind of violence against each other? So you might think that would support just a kind of minimal state where there might be police officers and criminal law and things that would protect us from harming each other, but it might not immediately support something as robust as a state that would be concerned with providing for everybody's needs, or social welfare more generally, or regulation of drinking water. That might all seem to be beyond the rationale for the state on this kind of view. But that's one of the things that we'll talk about in the segments to come.